Hello all and welcome to Risk Scout's webinar From Theft to Deposit, How Check Fraud Happens and How to Stop It. We are so excited to have you all joining us here today. Now, before we do dive into today's webinar content, let's roll through some quick housekeeping items. Risk Scout will be sharing all of today's webinar resources in a follow-up email tomorrow morning, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We also want this session to be as valuable for you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any of the questions that you may have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar panel on the side of your screen. We will also be running a few polls throughout today's webinar to help us and our speakers better understand you all, our audience, so your participation is greatly appreciated. Thank you in advance. Now, in case it is your first time joining us here for our webinar, Risk Scout is a team of former regulators, BSA professionals, and fintech developers helping financial institutions grow and be more efficient and profitable. Through a full BSA AML suite and specialized market tools, Risk Scout solutions increase revenue and decrease your compliance burden by unlocking new deposit streams and automating compliance workflows. If you're interested in learning more about how Risk Scout helps community banks and credit unions every day, visit riskscout.com and get in touch. Next month, Risk Scout will be hosting the webinar, Taking the CYA Out of KYC. We believe that due diligence shouldn't feel like a never-ending paper chase or a mad dash to cover your butt before your next exam. In this candid, practical session, former BSA officer and Risk Scout's Senior Vice President of Compliance and Operations, Kristen Parker, will walk you through what it really takes to get KYC right. Whether you're relying on a legacy platform or just trying to keep up with shifting regulatory expectations, this session will show you how to streamline due diligence, meet examiner expectations, and unlock true risk reduction across your portfolio. Visit our website to save your seat today. Today's webinar will be led by Mara Gibor, the Vice President of Intelligence Operations at Q6 Cyber, and Maria Noriega, the Intelligence Products Manager at Q6 Cyber. Mara has been a leader with Q6 for the past 9 years and has been instrumental in guiding teams of intelligence analysts who are responsible for dark web and e-crimes intelligence research and analysis. She has been interviewed by news stations across the country for topics that include check fraud, malware, social engineering, and more. Prior to Q6 Cyber, Mara held roles as a cybersecurity analyst and earned an MA degree in counterterrorism and security. Maria focuses on financial cybercrime trends excuse me, and has been tracking the stolen check market and check fraud trends in underground communities for the past 3 years. She has been featured on CNBC and other media outlets, has a master's of philosophy and a bachelor's in science and criminal justice, as well as certificates in forensic accounting and cryptocurrency. Maria is an experienced researcher and is internationally recognized and published for her work within the tech-centric criminal justice field. We are so excited to have them joining us here today, taking some time and sharing their expertise with us. Now, without further ado, I will go ahead and throw it over to Mara to dive into today's content and to tell us a little bit about Q6 Cyber. Mara, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for having us. We're very excited to be here today. So Q6 Cyber is an e-crimes intelligence firm. What do we do? Well, we monitor the deep and dark web, messenger platforms such as Telegram and Discord. We analyze C2, which is botnet infrastructure, to provide our clients with actionable intelligence. We also have very, very good visibility on the underground markets, so the places where cyber criminals would sell compromised payment cards or compromised accounts. We have individuals who are on the underground forums, which are communities where cyber criminals go to collaborate, to engage and sell, and to get advice for carrying out all different types of illicit e-crimes. So I have multiple teams of analysts under me who specialize in different areas of fraud and research. The team also engages in human to gain additional insights. So when I say human, this means that my team also is able to go undercover, if you will, and speak directly to the fraudster to make sure that we can pull out the intelligence that is so important for our clients. What you're looking at here on this slide is our subscriptions, and it's really divided into two different packages. We have the fraud package, which is highlighted in that orange. And within the fraud package, we have offerings such as compromised account credentials, compromised payment cards, check fraud, right? Check fraud has been huge over the past few years. So we are able to provide our customers with their checks that have been stolen and advertised on the dark web. And then we have the second package, which essentially is more for cyber threats, right? So executive monitoring, compromised employee credentials, what we call indicators of internal compromise, meaning we look for indications of what can be an employee compromise or a network intrusion, things like that. And then of course, third and fourth party risk.
All righty, that brings us to our first poll question. We just want to get a sense and a feel from our audience before we dive into our full content today. This question should be popping up on your screen and asking, what is the biggest challenge that you face when you're fighting check fraud at your institution? You can select any of these responses, whether it's detecting it early enough, maybe it's finding a good tool, staffing and resources, or maybe just communicating with those customers and members about whether or not this is actually a faulty check. We'd love to get a quick sense for who all we have on the call today, what challenges you're facing, so hopefully we can tailor the session directly to you as best we can. All right, we'll give you all just a couple more seconds to get these responses in. Excellent. All right, and we will turn these around. It looks like the majority of the folks that we have on our call today say that their number one challenge is just detecting that check fraud early enough before those losses actually are incurred. That is followed by limited staffing and resources with 17%, and we have a tie at 14% with both investigating and proving fraud as well as communicating with fraud customers and members. Fortunately, 0% are having a hard time finding a good tool. So that's great that everyone feels like they've got a solid tool in their pocket. Mara, let me pose this to you. Does this surprise you at all? Does this kind of align with what you tend to see when you're working with banks?
Sorry, had to get off mute. So yeah, detecting this type of intelligence earlier seems to be really a key factor of what we hear. It's so important to be more proactive, right, than reactive.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for that poll, and we will go ahead and dive into our full agenda today.
Perfect. So for today's presentation, we're going to dive right into the underground check market and discuss what one can find there. There's a lot more available than just checks for sale. After that part of the presentation, we'll go into different methods of how fraudsters are altering checks, which ultimately gets deposited by mules. You might be asking yourself, well, what is a mule? Don't you worry, we'll cover that as well, in addition to the different types of slangs that the cyber criminals are using to reference mules. Finally, we will end today's presentation with covering some recommendations for avoiding becoming victim to the stolen check cycle. So what we have here on this slide is a snapshot of the underground check fraud ecosystem. You see a little bit of everything here. As I was just mentioning, it's more than just a market where cyber criminals would go to purchase a stolen check. You have literally everything. So you have individuals selling arrow keys. You have individuals offering different types of mules. You have people selling USPS uniforms, alteration services, tutorials on how to alter the checks if you were an individual that did not know how to do it themselves. You can buy one of these tutorials and it will literally give you a step-by-step on how to do it yourself. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how checks are stolen. So this is really the number one question that we're asked. The predominant way is by targeting the blue mailboxes by obtaining the arrow keys, or by what we call alternative measures. So in the alternative measures, what is being offered are homemade fishing rods. So these are essentially a rod with a little sticky trap at the end, which will ultimately be inserted into those mailboxes. The sticky trap is used to attach itself to the mail. Fraudster pulls out the fishing rod along with all the mail that gets stuck to the sticky trap. So if you see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is just an advertisement that we saw. There is a fraudster who is offering for $300 a video tutorial on how to build your own sticky trap for $30 more, so $330. Not only will you get that video tutorial, but you will get a homemade fishing rod sent out to you, ironically, in the mail. But by far and large, the most popular way of obtaining the stolen mail is by getting your hands on some of those arrow keys. Fraudsters do not just target uncashed checks out of the mailboxes for check fraud. There's actually an entire market of previously cashed checks. So just by reference, when I refer to uncashed checks, this means that the checks have never, made it to its intended destination, which is a financial institution, to be deposited right because they were intercepted along its journey. Versus when I talk about cash checks, these are checks that made it to its intended destination, were cashed, but were stolen therefore after. So back to the digital compromise. So sources of this could be mishandling or disposal of the cash checks. Another way is check processors can also be subject to vulnerabilities where they can get their hands on previously cached check images and sell those. The third way that this can happen, and we've seen quite a bit of chatter on this, is through account takeover. In this scenario, the fraudsters obtain compromised credentials to a victim's financial account. They log into that account, and then they comb through transaction history or mobile deposit history, steal the images of the checks that were deposited, and then they monetize them. All right, so now that we spoke about how the checks are stolen, what happens after? Well, subsequently after the theft, they are advertised for sale in these underground markets. When I talk about underground markets, this primarily is taking place on Telegram. I'll show you a little bit later on in the presentation how these groups look when the checks are advertised for sale. But in any case, the checks are advertised as either uncashed or cashed. After that, a fraudster would comb through the markets, look for a check that they would want to purchase. They can either obtain the check, via mail. So in this case, they would have that physical check sent to them, or they would receive the check image. The primary goal is to adjust the amount on the check. Fraudsters can try to obtain the account balance to see the maximum amount that they can write the check for. And this involves calling the bank or credit union's automated balance prompt. Sometimes more information is needed, and there are shady lookup services available for fraudsters to use. So for example, sometimes the fraudster would need access to the victim's, maybe mother's maiden name, maybe social security number, and so on. There's a bunch of these, what they're calling lookup services in the dark web. They pay a small fee. They enlist the service to help them get whatever really piece of additional information they need in order to make this phone call. Okay, that's here on this slide is the same 3 steps that I just went over, but from an underground perspective, if you will. So if we start with step 1 there on the left, this vendor who sells stolen checks, this is a great example of a vendor who sells only uncashed checks. How do we know this? If we take a look at that first line in that advertisement, it says all slips, meaning all checks, are fresh and unused. Step number 2, this vendor, once you purchase a check, they are willing to send you either that physical check. Again, this would ironically happen in the mail, or if you prefer the check image, they'll be more than happy to send you that as well. Now in step 3, we have a video, but the sound is not working. So I'll kind of just walk you through what that video portrays. So it's an example of a fraudster who posted on Telegram their phone call to the financial institution's automated balance prompt. It's kind of that he's bragging that he was able to do it, but also bragging about how much money is in the account of the victim that is being targeted. And in this case, it was for over $1 million, which the fraudster was very excited about, right? Because the more money in this individual's account, the chances of writing a check for a higher amount is greater. Okay, perfect. Like I was saying before, I wanted to show you what these markets look like that are advertising and selling the checks. Typically, there'll be some indication of the check status, right? Meaning if it's cashed or uncashed. For example, on the left, these are uncashed checks, and we know that because of the shop's description as fresh out of the box, everything untouched. And on the right, it's very clear that these checks have been cashed because you know, whenever you see a cashed check, it's always the black and white image, and fraudsters typically refer to these as scans. Now, a little bit of a close-up of what the checks look like when they're advertised for sale. What I want to point out here, it's very important because what is missing on these two checks? So what is missing is the MICR line, right? On the top check, it looks like it was just cropped out. On that bottom one, you could see that red blurb over the MICR line. That's not us doing that. That is how these checks are advertised for sale. Essentially, that is what a fraudster is purchasing, is the information on the MICR line. So once the check is purchased, they would get access to that information. And now I will give it to Maria.
Thanks, Mara. Okay, for the next upcoming slides, we're going to be discussing the alteration process. Now, the degree and type of alteration is going to depend on whether or not that check has been previously cashed, as Mara previously outlined. Now, depending on the technique that's being used, it's going to be referred to as cooking, washing, or scratching, and we'll get into what those actually mean in the upcoming slides. Another important thing to mention here is the fraudster can go about doing these alterations himself, you know, should he have the skill set or desire to, but he can also outsource these alterations to other fraudsters who actually specialize in it. These individuals are typically referred to as cooks, and they operate what is known as either kitchens or labs in these underground communities. And here we have a little bit of it in practice here. So on the left, this is taken from a check shop, similar to the ones that Mara highlighted. And we can see in the description of this check, this shop actually pre-washes the check prior to sale and has included some PII alongside with it, potentially from those lookup services, like was highlighted earlier. Now in the middle, we have an example of a kitchen, which is listing out the alteration services it offers. And then on the right, we have an example of a course being taught by another fraudster, actually on check fraud, taught by a fraudster himself. If someone is inclined to essentially cut out the middleman, you know, these cooks, if you will, and do the whole process himself. Okay, moving on. So remember from earlier, a fraudster can choose in many cases how he would like the check sent to him. So in the case that the fraudster would like the original stolen check shipped to him, it's likely that this check is physically alterable. And that means that the ink can be either removed or can be scratched off by means that I'll show you in a bit. But ultimately, it's just physically alterable. And then we're going to go into examples of the physical alterations next. Next slide, please.
Hey, sorry, Maria, we had a question come in that I wanted to pose here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
That question asked, why do the people that are stealing the checks, why do they not follow through and do these themselves? Why do they end up outsourcing it to somebody else to actually commit that fraud? Do you know what we typically see there?
So in terms of outsourcing the alterations, because it does require some finesse to make it look as legitimate and improve the quality as much as possible, some fraudsters just choose to use one of these individuals instead of learning how to do it themselves. So that's primarily where we see that outsourcing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. We had another question that asked, are the folks that are purchasing these checks, do they tend to be individuals, or are they crime rings or groups of folks that are then executing this check fraud?
So we don't have visibility into who's actually purchasing these checks, but in theory, it could be both.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And please keep those questions coming on. We greatly appreciate them.
Great. Okay, so here we have it in action, as I was discussing in the last slide. So we have a series of checks which have been denoted as washable. Now this is indicating to the prospective buyer that the ink can be removed, albeit the ink has not been removed yet, as we saw that other check shop pre-washed the check prior to sale. We can see in the middle, this fraudster is using a technique called scratching. Basically what this is he is defacing the check with a sharp object. In this case, the tool of choice is a scalpel, and he's meticulously removing the ink from the target areas. In this case, we can see him actively removing the ink from the amount section. Ultimately, what will be done is a new amount will be printed on top, and any other location on the check that he did scratch out the ink, it would be printed on top as well. So that's what we see here. And then we do have a video on the right-hand side. We're going to play this for you. Props for creativity here. This individual is steaming the ink off the check, presumably while he's making dinner. So again, props for creativity there, but it just goes to show you there are numerous ways that they can alter a check physically. All right, now, not all uncashed checks are physically alterable. Now, for example, some checks may be written with gel ink, which is nearly impossible to remove, if not completely impossible. Now, in these cases, a fraudster would rely actually on check writing software or Photoshop, depending on the fraudster's preference. And ultimately, the check would be digitally recreated in either one of these tools and finessed that way. So here we have it again in practice. Now on both of these images, the fraudsters actually using Photoshop to recreate the check. So we don't see the check writing software in these examples. However, we can see here that they have meticulously copied over those check details. Now the indication here that these checks are uncashed, there's a few kind of key points here. The first is on the left-hand side, they kept the check number the same. So they transfer over the signature, the account holder, but they have the same check number. That's important. Now on the right-hand side, it might be small to see. However, I want to tell you that the date and amount have remained unchanged, also likely indicating that this check is uncashed. Now, as Mara outlined earlier, there is definitely a market for those cashed checks. This could be, from improper disposal or storage, or ultimately digital compromise. Now, these checks would be digitally altered using the very same techniques as if they were uncashed checks. So again, Photoshop, check writing software. However, cash checks do require additional details to be changed, so they require a little bit more alteration. And so here we have it again in practice. These examples, very interesting. I want to pay attention to where the arrows are, and we're looking at dates and amounts. But we're also critically looking at that check number. Now, remember those cooks that I was talking about earlier? So these are the guys that claim to have the secret sauce when it comes to calculating the check number. So in the case where a check has been compromised and it has already been cashed, they're trying to create, a counterfeit, and they do not know where this individual may be in their check sequence. So it's these guys that, using that original compromised check are able to guess where this individual may be when factoring it into this digital replica. So it's just a numbers game. It's a guessing game. They're calculating the time span between the date on the check, the date that, of the compromised check to present, and just adjusting to see where this person might be, trying not to, suggest a check number that be already used or too far out that it would be suspicious. So that's ultimately what's going on here. Okay, and I'm going to pass it back to Mara.
Great, thank you. So now that we know how these checks are altered, the fraudster is ready to deposit the check. And depending on how they would want to do that, they have a few choices. So if they would want to just go to the ATM or do a mobile deposit, it's as basic as getting, computer paper, printing that check on computer paper and making that a deposit. However, there's a lot of cyber criminals that don't want to take the risk of the deposit onto themselves. And that's when they would recruit or hire what is called a mule. So money mules are an essential part of the check fraud process. As a matter of fact, there's a whole economy, including vendors that specialize in the recruitment of these mules. A money mule is someone who transfers or moves illegally obtained money on behalf of someone else. Sometimes these individuals do it without realizing they are even part of a crime. In the next few slides, I'll be explaining about the most common types of mules used for check deposit, along with a specific mule account that is utilized.
All right, that brings us to our next poll question. We wanted to get your take on what your experience has been with mules. I know we haven't fully covered every detail about them, but before we get too deep in, has your institution experienced check fraud involving a mule or mule account within the past 12 months? You can give our responses here, yes, no, or maybe you're just not sure. That's why you're here, trying to better identify those mules and those mule accounts. And that's what we're here to help you with. So we'll give you all just a couple more seconds to get those responses in before we see how it stacks up and what our audience has experienced in this past year. Excellent, y'all are quick on the draw today. Thank you so much for those responses coming in. I will turn those around and we can take a quick peek at that. Looks like the majority of our audience has had that experience with a mule account in the past 12 months, and it actually might be even higher because a third of our audience, they're just not quite sure. So Mara, I'm sure we'll really appreciate diving in and learning a little bit more about these mules and seeing if there are better ways that we can identify them in our institutions. 10% saying no, they have not experienced mule activity in the past year. Mara, I'm curious, how does this compare to what you hear on the ground from the banks and credit unions you connect with?
Yeah, that's not surprising at all. I would say the majority does mention that they have identified mules trying to make deposits. The most common one is actually the one that I'm going to start with.
Excellent. Well, thanks y'all for your answers in that poll, and let's get back into it.
Great. So there are mules that are called walkers. Like I said, this is the most common one. Really, this walker has existed for the past few years. These are individuals who are recruited. They go in person to make that check deposit. There are brokers who actually do the recruiting of the walkers, and they choose them by race, age, and gender. And the most important thing about the recruitment process is that the appearance of the walker should match the name on the account. So again, that's a mule account. These individuals pose as the account holders, and the accounts that they're making the deposit in many times were opened with stolen PII or even with synthetic identities. Another type of mule account is what is called a head. These are individuals who are hired to deposit checks, but the difference is that they deposit the checks directly into their own account, so they're not using a fictitious account for this activity. In other cases, these individuals work with fraudsters to open new accounts at financial institutions, but again, they're using their own information. In many cases, the checks are deposited into accounts that are opened with fictitious and stolen information, but again, this is like a very slim amount of time. It's really used with their information. Heads are advertised in the dark web according to where they bank. So in advertisements, you could see some on the right-hand side of the screen. They are advertised, as to where they bank. So, hey, I'm looking for someone who has an account at like Navy Federal Credit Union or Bank of America, for example. They're also advertised by geographic area. The one thing I do want to point out here is that on the right side of the screen, that top post, the one that says your cookup was A1, meaning your check alteration was like amazing. The head, so the mule said the teller didn't suspect a thing. So this goes to show how well alterations are, but just how well using a head is as well. And again, individuals who use their own information or their own accounts to help deposit the stolen checks. All right, the last slide on the topic of mules that we're going to talk about is what is called facers. And this is not a mule per se, but rather a type of mule account. These accounts are created using what is coined or termed as pros. So pros is a term in the underground that represents stolen PII from individuals with high credit scores. In many cases, pros can also include additional pieces of information such as driver's license number or even the actual picture of the driver's license. Since you can do more bad things with pros, they generally cost more money than what is coined as a fulls, which is just a term for a stolen piece of individual's PII. So the basic, right? Individual's full name, date of birth, and social security number. Our intelligence suggests that what is unique about facer accounts is that, unlike other mule accounts that are created, many times the account needs to be aged in order not to get flagged for fraud when depositing a large sum of money right after the account was created. Cybercriminals have tested and learned that when accounts are created with stolen PII of victims who have high credit scores, it is less likely that those accounts will be flagged for fraud when making large deposits after creation. And you can just see an example of that. Take a look at that first screenshot on the left, the one that's the Chase receipt. A cybercriminal posted this, kind of, again, bragging that they were able to deposit a check for a very high amount into a facer account.
Okay. Oh.
All right. Sorry, before we get into our next section on the actual trends that we are seeing here around check fraud, we wanted to ask, how confident are you in your current check fraud detection tools? Now, we know there could be a wide variety. We have lots of different asset sizes joining us on the call. So maybe it's a super powerful enterprise level solution. Maybe this is an Excel document that you use internally or just by yourself to help track things. Regardless of what it is, we want to know, how is it serving you? Are you very confident in it, somewhat confident, not very confident, or maybe you're right in that bottom category and you just don't even have a dedicated tool for check fraud? We'll give you all a couple more seconds to get your responses in here, and I'll be curious to hear from our presenters on how this stacks up to what they encounter in the market. All right, excellent. Well, thank you all for those results. It looks like we've gotten a pretty consistent majority here across all of our different poll questions that we've asked. Today, it is on the somewhat confident. They are somewhat confident in our current check fraud prevention tools. We have 21% that are not very confident and 19% pretty close that are very confident. And then only a small percentage, 5% of our folks today that do not have dedicated tools. Mara, let me ask you, how does this stack up? Are you surprised that people are only somewhat confident in the tools that they're using?
No, it's usually a multi-layered, strategy, right? People, or I should say, organizations come to us because they need an additional layer, and that's when Q6 Cyber comes into play because we are able to identify the stolen check right after it, goes to market, but before it gets purchased and altered and ultimately deposited. So we're the pre-fraud strategy.
That's excellent. Thank you all for sharing those results with us. Greatly appreciated. Let's get back into some trends.
Okay, let's start off with the first one here. This is the 3D printing of USPS arrow keys. So I think earlier on the presentation, you saw a screenshot which showed, that fraudsters have access to arrow keys and they also sell them, as Mara highlighted. Now, what we're focused on here is fraudsters using 3D printing technology to make copies of USPS arrow keys to scale their operations. A fraudster may have access to an entire zip code with one of these arrow keys, but ultimately he still has one key. So he would still have to go box to box in order to access all of that mail. So fraudsters are strategizing, trying to use the latest technology to see if it can benefit from this. So they are exploring whether or not these arrow keys can be copied, ultimately to scale their own operations so that they can target multiple boxes at the same time, or alternatively monetize them. These keys go for thousands in underground markets. So if they were able to copy keys from a zip code, not even with the intention potentially to use them, and just sell the copies, they could make a lot of money that way. So this is something that we're currently monitoring. There's limited chatter on this, which is likely attributed just to people being less familiar with 3D printing technology. Nevertheless, having a 3D printer, it does require specific software, as well as, these are not commonplace in households. So it's likely attributed to that, but this is something that we're definitely keeping tabs on, because certainly if they figure out how to do this, it could have devastating consequences. Moving on, positive pay. Okay, let's talk about positive pay in general. Now, fraudsters have become aware that business account checks likely have positive pay. And in doing so, they have adjusted their operations accordingly. So what's going on here is not only are they aware of positive pay, they understand the limitations and the restrictions of positive pay. So they understand then that they can't alter the face of the check should they want that check to clear. So they have to figure out how to deposit the check without altering it. So that's a challenge. So what's interesting is they are opening up fake businesses in different states with very similar or the same name as the payee, granted it's a business, and then they are using that check to initially fund a business account that they've created using this fake business that they have registered, and then they deposit that stolen check. Now, unfortunately, to catch this, it appears to be a very manual process that involves leveraging a few different things, like the registration date of the business compared to the date of the check. So there are, sorry, my notifications are going off here. There's a lot of things at play here. But what's really important to keep in mind is that positive pay is incredibly helpful, but it is not a 100%. Okay, next up, cashier's checks. Now, cashier's checks have become increasingly popular within the digital underground, which also has sparked a new method where fraudsters are actually opening up bank accounts and they're using small amounts of cash to fund these accounts. Now, at the same time, they're purchasing immediately, they're purchasing a cashier's check for a very low dollar amount. Now, from there, the fraudster will alter that cashier's check to a much larger amount that was written on the check, and they'll do this either digitally or by forcibly removing the ink. And then the altered check is passed to what's known as a head, as Mara highlighted, individuals willing to use their own identity to deposit these checks in a branch, and the check gets deposited. So there's a few things to look out for in this cashier's check scheme. First is the distraction. So a fraudster may cash out a legitimate cashier's check as part of the transaction and kind of sneaking in the altered one at the same time as a distraction tool. Another thing to note is usually they come in twos. So the head might be accompanied by, say, a driver, which could be the fraudster in the parking lot, or he could be on the phone while requesting the cashier's check. Same goes for the fraudster. When it comes to deposit, this often is for an insurance policy to make sure that the mule doesn't go off with the money. So the fraudster may be nearby to basically confirm the transaction. So keep in mind those things are at play here. And in general, we recommend that all cashier's checks are on positive pay, and especially educating tellers and branches about this method. And then similar, on the similar vein, money orders. So they're applying the same alterations techniques to money orders as that of cashier's checks and just checks in general, and that is altering the face value of the money order for a much larger sum to try and cash it out that way. So this has been trending, especially at the end of last year, and we continue to see it discussed by fraudsters. But what's notable about money orders as well as cashier's checks is that there's an ease of obtaining these, and that makes them attractive. They can also actually use stolen debit cards to purchase the money orders as well as a way to cash out the account. Okay, and to wrap things up, we would like to leave you with a few best practices. The first, teller education is really important. They are often the ones on the front line. Educating them about how mule activity typically presents or spotting altered checks is essential. In some cases, they're able to delay the transaction with some delay techniques, able to call authorities and get these individuals apprehended almost immediately. So teller education is really key to try and fighting this. The second is more financial institution oriented, and that's adjusting your policies. The only other people that know your bank or your financial institution as good as you do are the fraudsters. They know your policies, your deposit policies, your hold times. They know everything about it. And this is factored in when they're looking to try and create mule accounts at financial institutions. So something to consider, maybe being a bit stricter, in terms of holds or deposit policies for newly created accounts. And I say this because fraudsters want their money as quickly as possible. So ultimately, if you delay that, to some extent, they might go shopping around to create a mule account somewhere else who more easily gives them their funds. So since they want their money as fast as possible, this can be used as a deterrent against mule account creation and thus mule activity. And then last, positive pay. Positive pay with payee name enabled is a very useful tool that should be used alongside routine monitoring to help mitigate check fraud. But the key is still routine monitoring. Should an account be victim of check fraud, the best practice is to close the account. That MICR information, with the account number, that is exposed to try to prevent any additional fraud on that account. It's best to close it and transfer the funds into a new account. And that concludes our presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for that. That does bring us to the Q&A portion of our webinar, where you all, the audience, get to ask our experts any questions that you might have about what we covered here today. And thank you to those that already have. We've already got some good questions here locked and loaded, so much appreciated on that front. Now, before we do dive into those audience questions, we do have one final poll question, which should be popping up on your screen now. This is a completely optional poll question, and you can respond with as many or as few responses that you like. But we would just like to know if you would like to get in touch with us here at Risk Out or our friends at Q6 Cyber, a Risk Out partner, to help out with your BSA, AML, or fraud program. So please feel free to select as many or as few of those answers, and we will be sure to follow up with you in kind. Excellent. As a reminder, you guys can go ahead and ask any of those questions on the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen under those questions tabs. We do have a limited amount of time, and there are some things that we might not be best equipped to answer live on the call. So we might take those questions offline with you and follow up if we need a little bit of additional time to think them over. So thank you in advance for those. Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. We had a question that asked, are there certain types of financial institutions that are more likely to be targeted by check fraud than others? Maybe that's a credit union versus a bank. Is it geographic location, asset size? What are those things that our bankers on the call can keep an eye out for?
I'll take this one. There doesn't appear to be really any preference. Ultimately, it's at the fraudster's discretion. Whether or not, for instance, he wants a bank with mobile deposit because that's his personal preference, or rather if a fraudster prefers like brick and mortar and being able to go in branch to deposit. So ultimately, no, the short answer is no. All financial institutions are kind of subject to this. And fraudsters are going to have their own preference in which financial institutions they want to work with. Also their accessibility to those financial institutions. So yeah, that's the short answer.
That's great. Thank you for that, Maria. Just to add on to that, I think there was a recent report by Bank Director where they estimate that 94% of financial institutions have experienced check fraud in the past 12 months. So I think, Maria, that goes to your point that fraudsters are not discriminating. This is widespread. So something that you should keep an eye out for either way. Mara, I think this might be a better question for you. This, since you spoke about mules a little bit, we had a question asked when a mule is caught in the act, when they're inside of that bank or credit union trying to deposit a check, do the other fraudsters involved also get caught alongside them?
That's a good question. I don't know about all cases. I know from some conversations with some of our customers, they were able to arrest both the individual inside and then the one that accompanied them. Many times they do have an individual accompany them, and that's why we recommend to make sure that when your teller's making a transaction with anyone, not to make sure they tell them to take out their headphones or earbuds, right? Because that other individual is actually feeding them the answers that the teller is asking them. But definitely, at least I know of a few cases that both people were caught.
That's great. Thank you for that. We had somebody, and we were just talking about policies and procedures and how our institutions can update those protections internally. Do we have a recommendation for how long the time period should be to keep a cash check in the branch location?
In terms of timing, I don't really think that we can comment. I think it's really dependent on the financial institution. You have to weigh existing customers who are legitimate customers, right? And not try and impede, them accessing their money. But at the same time, you have to weigh how easy it is for, say, a fraudster to get those funds instantly. Trying to make it a little harder, daily minimums, to explore kind of different ways of tackling that. But ultimately, it will be the financial institution that decides what's best for them.
That's great. We had a similar question that asked, How do these fraudsters know our policies and procedures already? Or is this information that they're also finding on the dark web, or is it just common information?
So it's kind of a mix of both. Sometimes this information is available online, but fraudsters do share this type of information with other fraudsters in these communities. What banks work best for this or that, or what they're having experience with at some financial institution. So yes, they do share many of those details within these underground communities amongst themselves, but at the same time, this information can also be found likely at the financial institution's website as well, likely in many cases. So it's probably a mix of both.
Yeah, just to add to that, fraudsters do look out for when institutions roll out new products. So I'll just use Zelle as an example, right? They definitely watch to see whenever a financial institution is going to start offering Zelle, and then we'll see them kind of try to target that institution or the customers of that institution. So they definitely do look for these types of things.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. Are there any questions that y'all have found asking upon account opening as part of the due diligence questionnaire? Are there any of those questions that work well to weed out the fraudsters, or maybe give that teller a little red flag that maybe this isn't an account that we want to pursue?
I don't know if we can honestly comment on that, whether it's, due diligence or EDD. Ultimately they will try and make, their representation of an individual, whoever they're posing as, look as legitimate as possible. We really can't comment on the authenticity of, their documentation or anything to kind of look out for. Other than kind of like the obvious, like Mara was saying, where they're clearly being fed information. But in terms of documents, yes, they're likely going to be using, fake documents. But, what exactly to look out for in terms of that, like specifics, I don't think we can comment.
That makes total sense. I appreciate the input there. I think we have one more question, and that's asking if you have any recommendations for getting law enforcement involved when there is suspected check fraud activity, especially, I think Mara, you mentioned that sometimes the other fraudsters that are in the loop might actually be physically nearby. Is that something that you should do immediately, or you follow up with a suspicious activity report? How would you recommend going about that?
Every financial institution is different, right? They have their own, rules, regulations of how they go about, in this process. I do know though, when, again, hearing from, just discussions with some clients, that when someone's in the branch and they're suspicious, and they're very suspicious, and they know, the individual's not who they say they are, they do get law enforcement involved pretty quickly. I mean, past that, I don't think we have visibility into what actually happens.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I know if you've been to other Risk Out webinars, you've heard our team harp on this at all, that there's building that relationship with your local law enforcement proactively. It pays off when you do have moments of that suspicious activity. Being in a branch, already having that relationship with an officer or a department can be what makes a difference between apprehending someone quickly. So we always recommend, at least on the Risk Out side, being proactive about either arming your tellers with that information or going ahead and getting those officers into the branch when there isn't an emergency to try and build that bridge between those departments. So excellent. Well, I think that does close out all of the questions that we had today. And I know we're coming up on time here. We do want to greatly thank both Mara and Maria for spending their time and sharing their expertise with us. For all of our attendees today, please be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We will be sending out all of the resources, including today's recording, in an email that will hit your inbox early tomorrow morning. So be sure to keep an eye on that. We do have a brief survey that will be following today's webinar. We'd love to get any feedback that you have on today's sessions, any requests for future webinar sessions, topics that you'd like to hear about. So please take a moment and share your thoughts with us there. If you do have any additional questions, if you want to learn more about Risk Out or Q6 Cyber, or if you just want to stop by and say hi, be sure to come visit us at our website. You can find us at riskout.com. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Mara, Maria, thank you again. It really means a lot.
Thanks for having us.